Throughout history, people of all ethnicities and races haven't had many rights in the United States, especially African Americans. They were segregated, could not vote, were slaves, and were not given good quality items such as food, education, transportation, etc. However, a move to a more equal society was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. From this act, it prohibited loss of discrimination in employment, among other things. However, if it weren't for certain events in history, this act would not have come to fruition. To start, the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War ended slavery and included equal protection, the right to vote, and equal rights. While this is a move in the right direction, certain events such as the court ruling of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 implemented the separate but equal doctrine, meaning that as long as those other than whites are given equal opportunities, they can remain segregated.
African Americans were not paid well in the jobs that they had, or were still enslaved in a way without violating the 13th Amendment, the amendment that was supposed to guarantee the end of slavery.
In order for African Americans to have a chance at equal job opportunities, they threatened a march to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1941. Because of this pressure, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802 on June 25, 1941, which prohibited racial discrimination in places that were involved in the defense industry. This executive order was a milestone for the start of the Civil Rights Movement. In addition, just a couple of years later, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, which prohibited racial discrimination in the military. This executive order helped contribute to Executive Order 8802 and majorly helped set the stage for the rise of the Civil Rights Movement.
While all this stuff mentioned is still important to the movement, the Civil Rights Movement, which caused the Civil Rights Act of 1964, primarily started with the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case. This landmark case was filed because the daughter of an African-American man, Oliver Brown, was forced to go to a segregated black-only school in the Topeka, Kansas school district, rather than a different school, which would be much closer to the family's home. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of Oliver and overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson case by saying that the separate but equal doctrine went against the Constitution.
However, some states still felt as if they could bypass this ruling and still segregate African American students. While all of the Civil Rights Movement played a role in the creation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the main cause of the Civil Rights Act revolved around the stand in the schoolhouse door event in Alabama in 1963. It all started when two African Americans named Vivian Malone Jones and James Hood applied for the University of Alabama. They were accepted and enrolled in the school. They had picked their courses and arrived at Foster Auditorium on June 11, 1963, to have their course list reviewed and to pay their fees.
Governor George Wallace of Alabama, along with state troopers, were in front of the Foster Auditorium, blocking the entrance. This was a way for them to hint that they would not be allowed to enroll in the school because of their race. The U.S. Deputy Attorney General with federal marshals and the Alabama National Guard asked Governor Wallace to move and let them in. However, the governor refused and gave them a speech to denounce the federal government, saying that it was encroaching on the rights of sovereignty of Alabama, even citing the 10th Amendment to back him up.
From this, Katzenbach told President Kennedy about this incident. In response, Kennedy issued Executive Order 11111, which authorized the federalization of the Alabama National Guard under the Insurrection Act of 1807. A few hours after Governor Wallace's spiel, the Guard General Henry Graham asked Wallace to move because of the order of the president. Wallace then eventually moved and let Malone and Hood complete their registration for the school.
Because of this occurrence, President Kennedy later that day felt it was his responsibility to educate the nation on civil rights and proposed a plan to help. Known as the Report to the American People on Civil Rights, President Kennedy and Theodore Sorensen wrote an impromptu draft of a speech only a few hours before he would broadcast it to the whole nation. While he and others who worked on it did not fully complete the speech, President Kennedy worked with what he had and made a revolutionary speech at the time.
President Kennedy started by talking about the integration of the University of Alabama and what had happened earlier that day. He then talked about how bad racial segregation and discrimination was in society and called all Americans to contribute to this new movement. President Kennedy then proposed legislation that would lead the nation to end discrimination against African Americans while providing them with equal treatment. This would later be known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
On June 19, 1963, President Kennedy sent the legislation bill on civil rights to Congress. The bill contained provisions for equal accommodations in public facilities, required the Attorney General to initiate school desegregation lawsuits, programs to ensure fair employment, the establishment of a community relations service, and the granting of authority for the federal government to keep funds from places that still enforce discrimination. However, Congress stalled to make this bill a law.
Like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he and other figures organized an official march to Washington, D.C. to pressure Congress to take action on civil rights. The Big Six, which was composed of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., James Farmer, John Lewis, A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, and Whitney Young, all led the revolutionary event on August 28, 1963, known as the March on Washington. Over 250,000 people attended and protested against racial discrimination and to pressure Congress on the civil rights legislation that they were holding off. This event was also where the famous I Have a Dream speech came from.
A couple of months later, President Kennedy called congressional leaders to the White House in October of 1964 to line the necessary votes needed in the House of Representatives for the bill to pass. It was reported out of the Judiciary Committee in November 1963 and was referred to the Rules Committee. However, in that same month, something tragic happened. President Kennedy, on November 22, 1963, was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas. Because of this, Lyndon B. Johnson had to take his place as president.
Thankfully, President Johnson was in favor of JFK's civil rights bill and did everything he could to get the bill passed in honor of him. After debate, the House passed the bill on February 10, 1964, on a 290 to 130 vote, and was given to the Senate on February 26, 1964. However, it remained in the Senate for a few months due to some senators calling for a filibuster.
However, the filibuster ended up having a closure on June 10, 1964, and was the first time in history that a filibuster had a closure on a civil rights bill. The bill ended up passing the Senate with a 73 to 27 vote on June 19, 1964, along with a subsequent amendment. The House agreed to the subsequent state amendment with a 289 to 126 vote, and the bill passed both houses of Congress on July 2, 1964. Later that day, President Johnson signed the act into law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was then a law that has been very helpful in protecting civil rights up to the present day.
From the success of the Civil Rights Act, it prohibited discrimination in employment, voting, and more while enforcing desegregation in public facilities and schools. This act also extended to the disabled, the elderly, and women. This also paved the way for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited literacy tests and other voting practices that discriminated, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which banned discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of property, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from Title VII of the Civil Rights Act to enforce the prohibition of discrimination in a workplace and would sue employers if they are found allowing it.
All of this happened over 60 years ago. While that may seem long ago, it is very recent history. This act and the civil rights movement still affect us today by protecting all citizens of the United States from discrimination and having access to the same opportunities, no matter their age, gender, or race. And with that, we hope you consider what happened during this time and how if it weren't for the presidents or the people of that era, we would not have a freer society than we do today.
And with that, in case we don't see ya, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
And good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
Well, we screwed that up.